Hello ladies and gentlemen, this video is going to be about the case study US versus China. Donald Trump has finally dealt his first blow to China's economy. Let's get into depth about it. Let's start off with the executive summary of the case study. On the 20th of January 2018, the United States of America imposed 30% tariffs on all imported solar panels. As most of the US imported solar panels come from China, this move can be evaluated to be aimed against China in particular. How did Trump decide on the level of 30% tariffs? Well, by implementing 30% tariffs on imported solar panels, Donald Trump was following the recommendations of an independent bipartisan panel, namely the U.S. International Trade Commission. The U.S. International Trade Commission's objective was to measure the harm to domestic manufacturers that was caused by foreign solar panels. On this basis, they gave a recommendation regarding the level of import tariffs. And why did the US impose those measures even? Well, the US accuses China of unfair trade practices due to large government subsidies. The US justifies it with the argumentation that about a decade ago, China was only a minor player in the solar panel industry. But by now, China accounts for about 2/3 of the world's panels. In the US, more than a dozen solar panel manufacturers actually had to give up their businesses because they couldn't compete with those Chinese manufacturers. So how were the US measures perceived by different groups? China itself showed strong dissatisfaction, understandably, but they also apprehended that the level of 30% is still quite a moderate approach. On the other side, US businesses that specialized in installing solar panels were unsatisfied with the measures as well, because they say that the decision also increases their costs for acquiring those solar panels that they need for their installations. On an international note, South Korea condemned the decision as, according to Kim Jong-un, it is against international trade standards. So why could these measures actually violate international trade standards? It is one of the main goals of the WTO to reduce government-introduced barriers to international trade. In this context, most favored nation tariffs, short also called MFN, play an important part. Those most favored nation tariffs are granted to other participating countries of the WTO. And MFN import tariffs for solar panels are actually at 0%. So solar panels are part of tariff-free trade. Nevertheless, in case of unfair foreign competition, there is the possibility to reprisal in two different forms. One can be as countervailing duties, which are in fact tariffs, to counter export subsidies of another country. And on the other side, they can also be in a short-term form as safeguard tariffs. Those can be in case a large-scale unemployment impinges on is threatening the country. So, on the basis of the available data, it is now necessary to determine the extent to which China and the US are acting in accordance with the regulations. Based on the contrary views and allegations, the questions further arises whether the US should accuse China of unfair competition. Has China engaged in unfair trade practices such as dumping or export subsidies? And does the US needs to counter that? And if unfair practices have indeed occurred, have they actually caused injury to the US solar panel manufacturers? Well, in the following analysis, we will investigate this further.
Moving on to the findings, I will explain about the two issues in this case study and provide them with a brief analysis. So the first issue is, if there is unfair trade practice done by China, does this cause injury to US producers? The answer is yes. Because if we assume this is true, which will be explained in the discussion, the unfair trade practice consisted of heavy export subsidy and dumping to the US market, then it causes injury to US producers. Because people will prefer to buy cheaper solar panels from China, and then the competitiveness of US solar panels is reduced. Therefore, the US producers will face difficulties to sell their products, which are solar panels. This is supported by the fact that the US International Trade Commission already voted unanimously that the Chinese companies have materially injured the US manufacturers. So it launched a a year-long inquiry into low-cost Chinese products that US manufacturers blame for putting them on the brink of collapse in 2011. The complaint is agreed by a lot of US citizens. The second issue is that US tariff that is intended to counter Chinese unfair trade practice is actually harmful for US workers. So a lot of workers from US are actually working in the solar industry. They argued that the punishing border taxes will increase their cost of production and deal a blow to their businesses. This is supported by the fact that tariffs on imported solar cells and modules have led to loss of more than 62,000 US jobs and $19 billion in new private sector investment, according to a market impact analysis released by the Solar Energy Industries Association. There is also a problem of conflicted opinions between the Commerce Department and the World Trade Organization. So on one side, the Commerce Department believes that China indeed violated the anti-dumping rule because they found that the China dumping rate ranged from 26.1% and 165.04%. They also found that China violated the countervailing duty law. They have provided big subsidies to the China solar manufacturers. They found that the calculated China supplied solar producers are supported by the subsidies ranging from 27.64% to 49.79%. Because of those facts, US decided to apply a high tariff to China. On the other hand, the World Trade Organization believes that US is the one who violated rules, which are the global trade rules, whereas China did not violate the anti-dumping rule and the countervailing duty law. So that will be the finding section, and it will be continued by my colleague to the discussion section.
Alright, so now I will be discussing about the alternatives which the US might take in order to address this issue with China. But firstly, I would like to discuss about the unfair trade practices by China, in addition to what FIA has previously discussed. So to begin with, we see that the International Trade Commission has voted unanimously to approve that there is grounds for utilizing tariffs, as solar world industries in America and other US producers have been harmed or threatened by said imports from China. In addition, we see that in October 2012, the US Commerce Department has found that Chinese producers have received subsidies worth of 14.78% to 15.97%, according to Song and Mayberry in 2020. There's also programs that is enacted by the Chinese government, which includes the Golden Sun program in 2009 and the feed-in tariff that they enacted in 2011 that helped the domestic market, as well as to allow them to compete as a major player in the world exports by 2013, despite them not being in the export market to begin with in 2005, which proves that these programs does give significantly great advantages to these Chinese producers. So, seeing that from what we have discussed earlier in the findings and the unfair trade practices done by China, we now have two alternative frameworks, which firstly is the aggressive approach, and the second will be the diplomatic approach. Now, the first approach is the aggressive approach is to use the provisions within Article 6.1a and 6.a of GATT 1994 to justify the use of countervailing measures to the Chinese solar panel subsidies. So as for the diplomatic approach, Mathew will go deeper into that later on. So firstly, I will discuss the aggressive approach, which basically is that since we see that there is a presence of subsidies towards exporting solar panels made by China, as we see the Golden Sun program, for example, in 2009, we now have a justification for the countervailing duties by the provision of GATT in Article 6.6a. Since it is stated there that no contracting party shall levy any anti-dumping or countervailing duty on the importation of any product or the territory of another contracting party unless it determines that the effect of the dumping or subsidization, as the case may be, is such as to cause or threaten material injury to an established domestic industry or is such as to retard materially the establishment of a domestic industry. Now, since we have proven and we have seen from the International Trade Commission that the subsidies that is enacted by China does have significant harm towards our party, which is the U.S. economy, we see that we fall under the provisions in Article 6.6a. And with that, we now have the right to justly levy some countervailing duties on what the Chinese government has exported. So, in addition, with evidence that China has pushed prices lower through subsidies and government programs, and since we see that there are price undercuts in the US, the provision of GATT Article 6.1a is thereby applicable by the US in retaliation against China, since they're not supposed to act unfairly to the US government. Since we're already proving that there are unfair practices done by the government of China, we therefore have enough justification in order to enact said tariffs that the Trump administration would like to pursue. So, with this, the US may apply the countervailing measures against the Chinese solar panels and anything else set forth. So now we can go into the discussion about the second approach, which will be discussed further by Mathew.
Now, I'm going to talk about what kind of policies and recommendations that the United States should take in order to resolve the issue at hand. So first, let's actually evaluate the situation. Should the US accuse China of unfair competition? On one hand, there are three things that the United States seeks to gain. First is to substitute Chinese imported solar panels with US produced solar panels. Second is to increase the income of the domestic solar panel industry. And the third would be to increase employment of the domestic solar panel industry. And on the other hand, the US is also bound to lose three things. First would be retaliatory countervailing tariffs from China. Second would be insufficient supply of solar panels in the US due to the tariffs. And finally would be rising costs for the US solar panel industry. So looking at those two sides of costs and benefits, let's take a look at some data. In terms of supply, we see that the imposition of the tariffs have shifted the geographical sources of US solar panel imports, where in 2012, most of US solar panels are originated from China, but since the imposition of the tariffs, it has shifted to other regions that may have higher cost competitiveness as the US does not impose them any tariffs, meaning that the dominance of Chinese solar panel industry have been decreasing since the imposition of the tariffs. Second, from the cost standpoint, let's take a look at other data as well. We see two important implications here. First, that the data of average value or cost of solar panels in the past few years have actually been consistently declining, meaning that even prior to China implementing the subsidies, they are already cost competitive in producing these solar panels. Second, we also see that besides the solar panel itself, the derivative products of the solar panels, namely electricity, have also been declining consistently in terms of cost for the past few years. Compared to other sources of energy, solar panel is actually currently the cheapest form of energy in the United States. This implies that actually China does not need to engage in non-competitive dumping or subsidy behavior to boost their exports, because it's actually already one of the cheapest form of energy in the market. So given those data, we have three recommendations. First, we think that the US should negotiate with China for a mutual and gradual unwinding of tariffs in the short term. We see that as of today, there are 4 waves of tariffs. In 2018, there are 3, and 1 in 2019. We think that the unwinding of tariffs should be done in a last in, first out basis, where the United States should unwind first the tariffs that they imposed in September 2018 and October 2019, as it constitutes a higher value of goods and services compared to the first 2 rounds of tariff imposition. And we believe that unwinding of tariffs would result in lower costs of many goods and services that are traded between China and the US, especially intermediate goods. So we know that, for example, in the case of solar panels, that they are imported from China as intermediate goods to be processed in the US or installed in houses of consumers. When we lift these tariffs, the cost of these solar panels and other intermediate goods will increase the competitiveness of US firms who import the goods from China and resell it in the US domestic market. Now, moving on to the second recommendation, we believe that the US should rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the medium term. Recall that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a cooperation between China, US, and 9 other countries on lowering tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. We believe that joining the TPP, which was negotiated in the Obama administration but was canceled in the Trump administration, will give the US some benefits. First will be to increase exports for the US. because currently existing tariffs from TPP countries raise US export prices by 40 to 59%. Second will be to increase wages for US workers, because we know, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, that export-related jobs actually pay up to 18 times higher compared to non-export related jobs. And finally, it would also increase the ease of doing business, especially for small and medium enterprises. We know that 98% of US exporters, most of whom are actually SMEs, will have lower red tapes and less bureaucratic measures due to the elimination of non-tariff barriers when they join the TPP. Finally, let's look at the final recommendation, which is utilizing industrial policy to boost US domestic PV industry in the long term. We believe that tariffs are not the optimal way of increasing our export competitiveness. Rather, the US should implement non-tariff measures, industrial policies, which are non-tariff strategies to revitalize, improve, and develop an industry. So to boost the production of the domestic solar PV industry, the US should focus in improving their solar panel comparative advantages, namely by paying attention to three main aspects. First would be to provide research and development or R&D grants for innovative solar panel firms so that they can incentivize further innovation. Second would be to increase taxes in non-renewable energy sectors such as coal, fossil fuels, or mining, so that the government will initiate a sectoral shift of resources from non-renewable energy to renewable energy, such as solar panel. And finally, would be to provide tax credits or subsidies for solar PV startups that are in the early stages. This is a form of infant industry protection, but it is not done through tariffs, but rather through subsidies and tax credits, which will be better for the firms located in the US, as it boosts their competitiveness as well as breed innovation, as opposed to blocking trade from overseas. Now, based on all of these recommendations, we believe that the US can improve their position in regards to the US-China trade war.
All right, so in selecting the best alternative, as we have already seen from Mathew's presentation previously, we know that the diplomatic approach is undoubtedly better. The reason for that is because the diplomatic approach seeks to foster cooperation with mutual understanding of the needs of both countries, since both countries need to be able to protect its citizens and their rights in order to maintain their economic well-being. And secondly, the US can gain more economic benefits in the medium and long term of its implementation. And because of that, we see that the diplomatic approach has much more benefits to the US economy in comparison to the aggressive approach. The reason being that in the aggressive approach, while we acquire the short-run benefits from decreasing competition from China, because we're able to add more tariffs and also make countervailing measures in order to make sure that our industry is protected from the low prices by China, the problem is that it increases political conflict between the US and China, since, of course, there's already great tensions between both countries with its history and with the different systems that both of these countries implement. And due to that, we see that adding more tensions in the form of a trade war would only worsen the political tensions between both countries. And in addition, there's also the possibility of a destabilization of the world trade markets, since one thing might lead to another. And as we've seen in previous cases of the US and China trade war, we see that there are a list that goes on and on about what tariffs the US would like to implement. So because of this, since it might be problematic for the world trade market, since it might influence on how trade works, if the US should pursue this aggressive approach, we believe that the diplomatic approach can gain the best outcomes for both parties, but mainly, of course, for the US economy. And with that, we go into the next slide, which is going to discuss about the implementation.
Lastly, we're going to discuss the implementation. As we all started to notice now, WTO, or World Trade Organization, is in danger of being dysfunctional. As seen by Trump's tariff, the US-China trade war, members are turning to self-help rather than resorting to the organization rules and procedures for dispute resolution. So, what is the possible solution that we can see from this case? First of all, the WTO needs to reform or strengthen the multilateral trading system, specifically the DDSU, or Dispute Settlement Understanding, in particular, the monetary compensatory remedy. And when is the best time to do this? Well, the best time to reform is now. If not, it will cause a great economic risk to the global trade. According to Robert Azevedo, the WTO Director General, and here I quote, with potential effect, for growth, jobs, and consumer rights around the world. End quote. So what are the advantages of reforming the WTO? It could discourage the members to have the confidence in underestimating the rules and procedure of the organization for dispute. And the drawback is while monetary compensation may not be the only solution to stopping the flow of trade wars, it will help toward preventing them and restoring the members' faith in the dispute resolution system. So that is all from us. Thank you, Dragons, for listening to our presentation. Hope you have a great day and stay healthy.